Hey guys, Yips here coming at you with another video, and today I'm going to do a Mythic Plus series on how to tank Mythic Plus keystones. Tanking Mythic Plus is a very difficult task no matter which tank you're playing and whether you're doing 15s, 20s, 25s. It is a hard role, and hopefully throughout this video series I'm going to be able to break it down into enough segments to where I cover most important topics, and hopefully you'll learn something that you can add to your arsenal in order to improve yourself as a player, push higher keystones, do things faster, whatever your goals might be as a tank in keystones. So I'll be playing the prop paladin for these videos. I'll be making references to the other tanks, so you'll be able to draw parallels back and forth and understand the differences between the tanks, understand how your defensives work in order to, engage mobs, live them, and learn how to make routes, all of those sort of different things. So the very first thing that I want to talk about in this video is how to manage your defensive toolkit throughout a dungeon as a tank. And this is the most important thing, is learning how to properly rotate through your defensive cooldowns when you're in a dungeon in order to minimize the damage you're taking. You do not want to go into a dungeon and have to rely on your healer to keep you alive. You want to go into a dungeon and rely on your own. You want to rely on yourself. You want to know that you're going to be able to tank efficiently without your healer and use your defensive toolkit to minimize the damage you take. That's not to say that your healer shouldn't be healing you, but that's just to be saying that you shouldn't all of a sudden go from 100% health to 10% health and expect your healer to be able to deal with that. So how do we use our defensive toolkit when we're initiating a pull? Each tank is a little bit different. So a class that's similar to Paladin in this sense is going to be something like a Guardian Druid. So what do Paladin and Guardian Druid have in common? Well, we can't use our passive defensive toolkit before we get into combat with the mobs. So Paladin has Shield of the Righteous, which increases our armor. We have Consecrate, which is something we put on the ground that makes us take less damage. Guardian Druid has to build up your rage in order to use your Iron Furs. If you don't have these passive things rolling, you're what I like to call naked. You don't have any defensives. You're going to get one shot and die. That means you're going to have to be using something active earlier on in the pull in order to cover up for that. Whereas classes like, say, Warrior and classes like Demon Hunter have things like Shield Block, which they can get Rage on when they charge, or Demon Hunter has things like Demon Spikes that they can use without any sort of preparation. They can use those things when they're initiating, and then use their active defensive utility a little bit later into the pull once the mobs are grouped. So, Prop Paladin, how are you going to engage a pack, and how should you manage your defensive CD rotation? So the thing that I like to use when I'm on my Prop Paladin, and what you should be doing, is first using your low cooldown ability. This is for many reasons. One, you want it to come back up for the next pull, or you want it to be back up later in your defensive rotation on the pack if it's going to live long enough. So you can use that initial short CD, and then it will come up again later so you can survive longer on a pull. Typically, you're going to be using your short CD first when you engage a pack. So for Paladin, that's going to be Ardent. For Guardian Druid, it's going to be something like Barkskin. So going into engage a pack, you want to be using that initial defensive CD fairly early on, or else, like I said, you're going to be naked and not have any defensive utility as you're engaging a lot of mobs, and you're going to get one shot and die. So you want to use that before all of the mobs converge on you and start beating you up. This gives you time to get things like your SOTR and your Consecrate active, or as a bear, it will give you time to generate rage and things of that nature to get your Iron Fur stacks up. So you saw there, I grouped the mobs. I initially used my Ardent early on in order to mitigate the damage that initially was going to happen, and then afterwards I quickly got my SOTR up and my Consecrate down. Like I said, for Guardian Druid, this might be your shield, or sorry, your Iron Fur stacks, and if you're playing a Warrior or a Vengeance DH and you're grouping mobs in this sort of a way, you might be, going in and putting on your uh, demon spikes or your shield block, and then as soon as the mobs get grouped together, you press that demo shout, you press that fell devastation, so you have overlapping defensive utility and you don't take a lot of damage off the rip. So always thinking when you're initiating a pack, some sort of combination of a short defensive CD plus your active, and using that in a way that when all the mobs are grouped on top of you, you have those things rolling so you don't take too much damage off the start. So always have some sort of initial plan in terms of what defensive utility you need early on in the pack. Now, Sometimes that initial, say, Ardent or Barkskin, may not be enough. Sometimes you might need something more powerful. You may need to overlap with a defensive utility trinket. You may need to use a shield wall early on in order to group the pack efficiently. This comes with practice and understanding what the packs do, but it's important, always have a plan. Never go in dry. That's not a sexual reference, just never go in dry as a tank. Always have something rolling initially, or you're going to be, as I like to call, bare, and I am absolutely terrified. If I go into a pack and I see my Ardent's down, my Guardian's down, my Aldehyde's down, my shield, my Bubble's down, I am terrified and I am playing like the the most scared person ever, and I will just try to limit the amount the mobs hit me as much as possible. That's not a good way of tanking because then the mob typically won't get grouped efficiently and your group will be really mad at you. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But tanking, you always want to have a plan. And that initial plan should be using that short CD defensive into getting your active mitigation up. Okay? So like I said, starting with that Ardent or say that Barkskin or that Demo Shout or that Fell Devastation. Now, after this defensive utility has been used, if it's enough, you want to be thinking immediately what you want to chain it with. Now, that can be a variety of things. That could be your defensive trinket, that could be a shield wall, that could be kiting or using some sort of group utility like binding shot or ring of peace. It can be a lot of different things and there's a lot of different options available to you, but you never want to be using nothing. You always want to be using something to take less damage. So when I'm grouping up a pack like this, typically I'll go in with my Ardent early on, and I can extend that, pretty easily because that's the way that Prot Pally works. But say here I'd be on my Prot Warrior, I'd have my Demo Shout rolling, I'd have my Shield block up, my Demon, or if I was on my Death Knight, I'd have my Demon Spikes and my Metamorphosis up, things like that. But once this utility is gone, you don't want to sit here with your base utility kit and say, okay, I'm going to tank the mobs and expect to live. No, you're on a hard pack. You want to be chaining it immediately with something else. And so my Paladin, typically I'll chain it with my Aldehyde. And that's a pretty good base rule as a tank. Chain that initial defensive utility with your short CD defensive trinket. And then once that defensive trinket is over and the pack, is still alive and you still want to be sitting here tanking it, use your next defensive, use your shield wall. Chain it. Don't use it when you're at 10%. Use it when you're high on HP before the damage comes in, and your healer will, one, love you and want to add you and play with you again because you're not taking any damage and they're like, wow, this tank owns. But it's also going to let you sit there and tank the mobs and establish more threat and keep your DPS happy and be able to sit in there and do a lot of damage in order to make the pull go a lot more quickly and smoothly. So when you have your defensive CDs available and you're doing big pulls, make sure that you're rotating your defensive CDs in a way that, one, makes sense, and two, keeps you alive and healthy and relatively comfortable throughout the pull. So like I said, chaining your defensives. And once you have a plan, you try it. If it doesn't work, you try something else. It's a trial and error thing, and sometimes, if the pull is too much, you just may not be able to do it, but that's fine. You learn, you take things away from that, and you change it up. There might be things you need to do in the pull that are making it hard, like kicking wicked bolts or whatever it might be on the pack. Each pack varies, but you need to have a plan, regardless of all of that, on how your defensive CDs are going to work. Now, obviously, for every pack, you're not going to have every defensive cooldown available to you. Now, what do you do when that is the case? So, for example, on a Prot Warrior, you might not always have your shield wall and your last stand, and you might only have your demo shout, and you're like, well, how do I make this pull work? You want to plan your route around where when you need your shield wall, it will be up, and you want to plan your route around when you don't have it, you're doing a pull that is still, relatively difficult, but you're able to manage in some sort of way. So typically this is a good second pull in halls, having these two mobs with the groundskeepers, the Hound Master, and the two Gargans. It's a difficult pull, but it's manageable with a low set of cooldowns because kiting it isn't too bad. So on Prot Paladin, like I said, going to initiate the pull once I get in combat with that Ardent. So as soon as the mobs are on top of me and hitting me, I'm going to get my Ardent, my passive defensives up as quickly as possible. And then once my Ardent is down and I've initiated my threat on the mobs, I start kiting and using slows and group utility. And that way, when I'm doing this, I don't have to use my other defensive utility because I'm going into a pack where I just can't kite it. I can't kite the shard. I can't kite those casters. I need my bigger defensive cooldowns up. So you'll be using group utilities, slows, things of that nature. And generally speaking, when you're doing that, your goal as a tank is to run around and keep the mobs as grouped as possible. You do not want to just, go in there initially, get threat, and then do this. This is really bad. Do not do this. You want to be going around in a circle using things like AoE stuns, using your binding shots, using your group utility, and that's when you rely on your teammates to help you, is when you're low on defensive cooldowns. So you make that initial defensive rotational cool decision where you say, okay, I'm using my Barb Skin, I'm using my Ardent, I'm using my Unused Trinket. I go and engage the pack and I group it up. And then once that's done, you don't say, okay, I'm going to tank this pack naked and pray I don't get one shot, because if the keystone level is high enough, guess what? You're going to get one shot. You want to have that plan that once those defensive utilities are done, you immediately start kiting. And this is when you start to push the higher echelons of keystones to, when you're doing 27s and 28s, that's when you start to play in this sort of a way where you're using your defensive utility to keep the mobs grouped and, effectively together. And once you are out of those defensives, you start running because the pack is hard enough to where you have to do that. Some pulls you're able to sit there and you're able to tank the mobs with your base toolkit up, your Iron Furs, your shield blocks, things like that. And you'll know typically what packs you can do that on. But most of the time, the pulls will be difficult enough where you'll use that initial defensive cooldown rotation and then you'll start finding an efficient way to kite. And this is really what will bring you to the next level when you start tanking. Now, obviously there's a lot more to that than really the base damage rotation. There's, initializing not only that base defense rotation, you also have to group the mobs efficiently. You have to be able to establish threat efficiently so that when you do start kiting, your group doesn't immediately rip threat off of you and start dying, and the mobs aren't scattered everywhere, and your group can't AoE them down because that's very efficient. And that's sort of the next thing that I want to touch on. And that will sort of be the end of this video when I touch on these things, and we'll go into things like routing, utilizing group utility, and stuff like that in later videos down the road. So that was, min-maxing your defensive rotations. Now let's talk a little bit about establishing threat and grouping the mobs on pull. So each tank is going to have some sort of button or some sort of way that you do increase damage in an extremely short period of time in order to get threat on the mobs, and a unique way of grouping. So, for example, DK might have Grip, Monkey might have Ring of Peace or Speed Taunt, Bear Druid, you have Typhoon, or you're just a bear. Prot Warrior is one that struggles a little bit more with this if there are casters. However, if there are melee, you can Heroic Leap, charge around to get mobs. You also have Heroic Throw, which is very good at pulling. Every sort of tank has a different toolkit in terms of pulling. Paladin has things like Hammer of the Wrath when your Avenging Wrath is up, you have Judgment, you have your Avenger's Shield, you have Taunt, right? And these are things that you want to be thinking about actively when you're aggroing mobs. You don't want to be just randomly attacking things. There should be some sort of science to the madness. So when I'm engaging a pack like this, there's three Obliterators, a Shard, and a Darkblade, and I want them to get together as quickly as possible so I can press my Divine Toll and get that initial threat. For Warrior, that might be your Spear of Bastion, and for DH, that might be your Elysian Decree. For Bear, you might be spamming your Thrash with your Incarn. For Monk, you might be using your ability, the Kyrian ability, and spamming your Cake Smashes, whatever it might be. You want to have them grouped as quickly as possible and then hit that ability that's going to give you all of that snap threat and do a lot of damage. So, when you're going into a pull like this, you want to have a plan on how you're going to tag each mob and get it grouped to get that initial threat. And for me on a prop paladin, when I approach a pull like this, I know I have to silence this obliterator to get him in. If you're not a paladin, you might have to grip it or get one of your teammates to kick it. You're going to want to taunt or hit the shard so it doesn't lag behind. If you just tag the collector, the shard is going to have some activation time and then walk in late, and you're going to want to tank on top of these obliterators. And this is typically what it's going to look like. So I'll go in, I'll Avenger Shield that, I'll taunt the shard as I go into these, I'll kick this, and everything will be grouped up quickly. I'll be able to hit my snap threat on my Divine Toll, and the mobs will be grouped. And when I did do this on my Vengeance Demon Hunter, typically what I would do is I would do a Throw Glaive on the pack over here. I would do a Fiery Brand on the Shard because he does a lot of damage, and then I would just hit the mobs in front of me And you can use different rotations. You'll have to learn what works for you for each pack, but there's always going to be a method to the madness on how you pull each pack and how you want to initially group. So I'll show you another pull that is relatively hard to group for tanks. So it's going to be these two, this Obliterator, this Darkblade, the Houndmaster, and the Bears. And this pull can be very difficult to initiate because there's a bunch of range mobs. And I just pulled the grounds or the Gargant, so that's not great. But typically when you're pulling this pack, you want to taunt the Houndmaster so he runs and doesn't shoot. And then you want to hit the Obliterator so he runs and he doesn't cast too early so they can all come in together. Okay? So there's always going to be some sort of mob that's optimal for you to hit in a pack in order to get it grouped. And you want to be thinking about that as a tank. And then once it is grouped or close together, you want to start using those heavy AoE abilities in order to establish threat quickly on all of the mobs so your group doesn't, rip threat and die as, when you're tanking. And if you don't have those abilities up, you need to let your team know. If you don't have Elysian Decree, you don't have your Divine Toll, you don't have your Kyrian Monk ability, you don't have Incarn as a bear, you need to say, okay, threat might be low initially on this pull. Be careful. Don't just say nothing and have your DPS go nuts on the start of a pull and die. Be active with your communication. Tell them that you don't have these things available so they know that threat might not be great. And really, that's how you initiate packs and dungeons. You learn how to group with your abilities, you learn how to make a good defensive CD rotation throughout the dungeon, and you win. So I'm just going to run you guys through like a typical route and explain how I might use my defensive utility throughout a dungeon. So for Halls of Atonement, let's make a little bit of an adjustment to this route. Typically, it will be something like this. And so for this sort of a pull in a Halls of Atonement on a fortified high level difficulty, we go to this first pack here. I say, okay, I'm going to use Ardent and Guardian of Ancient of the Kings. I'm going to use my on-use trinket and my bubble because it's incredibly dangerous and we're lusting and we need it to die. On this next pull, I'll use my Ardent and my on-use trinket because they'll come back up for this pull. And outside of that, if I have no more cooldowns, I just need to live. On the next pull, a very similar thing. I'll be having my Ardent available and my on-use trinket, and then my Bubble and my Guardian will be back up for this pull if I need it. After that, I'll have my Ardent and my Trinket up again, and then for the next shard pull, I'll have my Bubble Taunt and my Guardian. We'll do this pack as a cooldown resetting, so I'll have my Ardent and my Trinket, so you can kind of see the idea. You have a pull that's difficult where you use your big cooldowns, and then you have recovery pulls where it's hard to live, but you can do it with minimal defensive cooldown usage, and then we go into the boss with those bigger cooldown sets. You're always going to want to have a plan for each pack on how you utilize your defensive utility. So hopefully this video made sense. Hopefully it was a good start. In the next video, I'll be going over things like routing and understanding how to utilize your group's cooldowns because that's an equally important thing to understand as a tank and it's going to bring you more success in dungeons. Hopefully this was useful for tanks out there that are getting into dungeons. Thanks for watching and I'll see you guys later. Peace.